amid the peaceful apartment blocks of Singapore, a place long associated with order, cleanliness, and safety. One night in July 2021, the air suddenly filled with the sounds of shouting, frantic screams, and chilling struggles. When everything fell silent, the fifth-floor corridor of the Ang Mo Kio block was left with two motionless bodies lying in a pool of blood, a middle-aged Vietnamese woman and the man who had once been her common-law husband. There were no signs of a break-in, no signs of robbery, only a blood-stained knife, a few empty beer cans, and streaks of blood smeared across the cold gray tiles remained. What really happened inside that apartment? Join Crime Documentary Files as we uncover the case tonight. Late at night on July 15th, 2021, at exactly 12:55 a.m., the quiet atmosphere of the Ang Mo Kio residential area was shattered by an emergency call to the Singapore police hotline. On the other end of the line was a man whose voice trembled, his breathing uneven. He identified himself as a tenant living in one of the apartment blocks in the area. He recounted that earlier that evening, after having drinks with a neighbor, the two took the elevator up to the fifth floor as usual to return to their rooms. But the moment the elevator doors opened, an unexpected scene unfolded. Under the dim yellow light of the corridor, a woman suddenly appeared, and in an instant a fierce argument erupted between her and the neighbor who was with him. Shouts and heated words echoed through the empty hallway. Then, before he could grasp what was happening, a violent scuffle broke out, fast, chaotic, and terrifying, leaving him frozen in shock. In that moment of panic, instinct drove him to pull out his phone and snap a few quick photos of the scene, hoping to capture evidence of what his eyes had just witnessed. But soon, fear overwhelmed him, and he turned and ran. Less than 10 minutes later, the blaring sirens of police cars tore through the still night of the Ang Mo Kio neighborhood. Flashing blue and red lights reflected off the cold concrete walls as Singapore's rapid response officers arrived on the scene and entered the apartment block. Downstairs, Tan, the man who had made the emergency call, was still visibly shaken, his face pale with fear. Upon seeing the officers, he hurried over to recount everything he had witnessed, providing the first crucial details to help them locate the scene. Following his directions, the police moved swiftly to the fifth floor, where the altercation had occurred. As the corridor door swung open, a haunting sight met the investigators' eyes. A middle-aged man lay sprawled on the tiled floor, barely clinging to life, surrounded by a pool of deep red blood. His body was riddled with deep stab wounds to the neck, chest, and back. Blood continued to seep from his wounds, soaking through his white shirt. Right beside him lay a woman, also unconscious, her body drenched in blood, covered with multiple severe injuries. Nearby, a blood-stained kitchen knife with a wooden handle lay abandoned on the cold floor, its steel blade gleaming under the harsh corridor light. Both victims were barely breathing, their breaths weak and uneven. Without wasting a second, the police immediately called for an ambulance while performing first aid on the spot, desperately fighting to keep the two alive. At around 1:08 a.m., the piercing wail of an ambulance siren echoed through the silent night, weaving its way between the rows of Ang Mo Kio apartment blocks. Within minutes, emergency medical personnel arrived at the scene, carrying stretchers and medical equipment. They rushed into action under immense pressure, quickly bandaging and stemming the bleeding of the two motionless victims lying on the cold tile floor, before lifting them onto stretchers and transporting both directly to Tan Tock Seng Hospital. Soon after, the police sealed off the entire fifth floor of the building. Yellow tape cordoned off the entrances, and the scene turned eerily quiet, broken only by the soft footsteps and rhythmic clicks of the forensic team's cameras. Under the dim yellow glow of the corridor lights, the scene before the investigators looked like something out of a horror film. Long trails of blood smeared across the concrete floor, stretching from the apartment door toward the elevator, pooling into dark stains. The murder weapon was found right there. A sharp kitchen knife with a dark brown wooden handle and a gleaming silver blade about 20 centimeters long, the kind commonly used in Singaporean households for cutting meat. The blade was caked with dried, dark red blood, lying abandoned in the corridor, a silent witness to the crime. Scattered nearby were several empty beer cans and glass bottles, hinting at a drinking session that had spiraled out of control, where alcohol may have sparked the deadly confrontation. On the cold gray tiles, signs of a violent struggle were still evident. A pair of slippers tossed aside, a shattered mobile phone, and strands of a woman's bloodied hair. Investigators quickly noticed that the apartment door lock was intact, showing no signs of forced entry. This meant there had been no intruder. Everything had likely erupted between the people inside. When the forensic team arrived, they meticulously photographed and marked each bloodstain, sealing the knife for fingerprint and DNA analysis. Tragically, despite hours of emergency treatment at Tan Toc Seng Hospital, the male victim did not survive. He succumbed to massive blood loss and multiple deep wounds to the neck, chest, and back at 7:17 a.m. that same morning. As for the female victim, she was fortunate to survive after undergoing emergency surgery. However, she sustained severe injuries, suffered major blood loss, and remained in a state of exhaustion and shock. But what exactly had happened between these two people? Who was the attacker? And who was the true victim in this bloody midnight tragedy? That was the crucial question that drove the Singapore police to launch an urgent investigation to uncover the full truth behind the case. From the initial scene assessment and witness statements, investigators quickly ruled out the possibility of a third-party intrusion. All the evidence indicated that the fight had taken place solely between two individuals who knew each other, and that the tragedy likely stemmed from a long-standing personal conflict. For that reason, identifying both people and understanding their relationship became the key to uncovering the real motive behind the crime. Based on residency records and neighbor testimonies from the surrounding apartments, police soon established the identity of the male victim. His name was Cho Wang Kung, aged 51, a Singaporean of Chinese descent who had lived in the Ang Mo Kio area for the past 15 years. To his neighbors, Cho was known as a gentle, mild-mannered, and friendly man, though his personal life, as it turned out, had been far from peaceful. He worked as a jewelry assembler for a local goldsmith company, earning a stable income and living a simple, steady life like many other blue-collar workers. Through years of hard work and saving, he eventually managed to purchase a 3-room apartment in Block 562, Ang Mo Kio 5A. To supplement his income, he rented out part of the flat to tenants. According to a longtime neighbor, Cho Wang Kung's personal life had seen its share of ups and downs. Around 15 years earlier, he had moved into Ang Mo Kio with his first wife, a woman from Hong Kong. They were once regarded as a happy couple, a gentle, hard-working husband and a kind, capable wife. Together, they had a young daughter, their pride and the emotional bond that held the family together. However, the marriage did not last. After a few years, differences in personality and cultural background gradually surfaced, causing emotional distance between them. Eventually, they decided to part ways amicably. The daughter stayed with her mother, while Cho remained alone in the small Ang Mo Kio apartment. That home, once a quiet refuge, would later become the setting for the darkest and most tragic chapter of his life. Not long after, Cho remarried a younger Vietnamese woman, gentle, modest, and more reserved than his first wife. At first, this second marriage seemed to offer him a chance to regain the warmth of family life. Together, they had a baby girl, a child he loved deeply and cared for with devotion. To him, she was the greatest source of comfort after years of loneliness. Yet that happiness, too, was short-lived. As financial pressures and cultural differences resurfaced, marital tensions began to grow. By 2018, his Vietnamese wife had moved out, taking their young daughter with her, leaving Cho alone once again in the quiet, empty apartment. Even so, Cho maintained good relationships with both his daughters, especially the younger one from his second marriage, for whom he cared deeply. According to a longtime neighbor who had lived beside him for years, Cho Wang Kung appeared to be a gentle, polite, and easygoing man. He always greeted others with a warm smile, spoke softly, lived moderately, and treated people with respect. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, he was also sociable and enjoyed companionship. After work, he often joined friends at nearby beer stalls, partly to unwind, partly to fill the void of his solitary life after 2 failed marriages. Though mild-mannered by nature, drinking gradually became a regular habit, a familiar ritual in his daily routine. Neighbors would often joke, "Mr. Cho only really lights up when someone offers him a few cold beers." With his friendly personality, he was well liked by both friends and neighbors alike. Then, in July 2020, Cho unexpectedly allowed a single woman to move into his apartment. The arrangement quickly caught the attention of other residents in the block. Some, unable to contain their curiosity, began whispering about the nature of their relationship. Cho, however, simply smiled and explained that during the difficult COVID-19 period, he only wanted to help someone who had fallen on hard times and was struggling to find a place to live. As time passed, neighbors gradually noticed that the relationship between the two went beyond that of a simple landlord and tenant. When news spread that they had officially become a couple, most who knew them offered sincere congratulations. Everyone believed that, after years of loneliness and 2 failed marriages, the gentleman had finally found happiness again. And the woman at the center of the tragedy was none other than Nguyen Ngoc Giau, the surviving female victim at the scene. She was 43 years old, a Vietnamese woman with a complicated past and a life marked by hardship, instability, and resilience. A story filled with both struggle and sorrow in a foreign land. Born and raised in southern Vietnam to a modest family, Giau's childhood was defined by deprivation and loneliness. Her parents divorced when she was still a little girl, leaving behind a deep emotional scar. Raised by her grandmother in difficult financial conditions, she learned to fend for herself from a very young age. Driven by a desire to change her destiny, in 2010, when she was in her late 20s, Giau left her hometown and moved to Singapore in search of a better life. In her early days there, she worked as a hostess at a karaoke bar in Geylang, a bustling but notorious district known for its temptations and risks. The job was far from easy, physically demanding and often dangerous. Yet, it was during this period that fate introduced her to a Singaporean man. After only 2 months of acquaintance, Nguyen Ngoc Giau married him, marking the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Through this marriage, she soon obtained permanent resident status in Singapore. The couple had 2 children together, her greatest joy and the emotional anchor that gave her purpose in a foreign country. But what seemed like a happy marriage soon began to fracture. Differences in language, culture, and lifestyle gradually widened the gap between them. Her husband was quiet and emotionally distant, while Giau, a sensitive, emotional Vietnamese woman, longed for warmth and understanding. As small disagreements grew into constant arguments, financial stress and loneliness began to weigh heavily on her. Giau spiraled into psychological distress, plagued by insomnia, emotional breakdowns, and eventually, severe depression. At her lowest point, she even attempted to take her own life, but was found in time and hospitalized in a psychiatric ward. Although she survived, she carried deep psychological scars and began turning to alcohol as her only means of escape. Around 2018 to 2019, Giau separated from her husband, leaving her 2 young children in his care, partly because of her unstable financial situation and partly because she wanted to rebuild her life independently on her own terms. Carrying only a few belongings and a small amount of savings, she began struggling to make ends meet in a foreign land. Thanks to her hairdressing skills, which she had learned back in Vietnam, Giau opened a small hair salon in a neighborhood populated by many Vietnamese migrants. The shop was modest but warm and welcoming, soon becoming a familiar gathering place for the local Vietnamese community in Singapore. Not stopping there, she also sold goods online, from cosmetics to household items, to earn extra income. Every bit of money she made, she faithfully sent back home for her 2 children. Yet amid the fast-paced rhythm and loneliness of life abroad, the laughter at her salon couldn't fill the emptiness inside. Each night, when she locked the shop and returned to her small rented room, she was left alone with silence and the ache of missing her children. The last time she saw them was in 2019, before the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. When strict lockdowns came, she was unable to return home, separated by distance and circumstance. It was during this period of isolation and emotional struggle, while fighting to survive and rediscover meaning in life, that Nguyen Ngoc Giau met Cho Wang Kung, a man who had also endured 2 failed marriages and carried emotional scars of his own. At first, their relationship was purely practical, landlord and tenant. Cho rented her a small room in his 3-room apartment, partly to help her through financial hardship during the pandemic, and partly to ease his own loneliness. Everything might have remained that way, until one day it was Cho's 4-year-old daughter, with the innocent curiosity of a child, who unknowingly became the matchmaker that brought the 2 adults closer together. That day, the little girl took her father's hand and gently placed it into Giau's, cheerfully saying, "You two should be together." The innocent words made both Cho and Giau burst into laughter, but behind those smiles, something quietly shifted, a touch of warmth, a spark of empathy, and perhaps a faint stirring of affection between 2 hearts that had both been wounded by life. Gradually, care replaced distance, and understanding became the bond that drew them closer. By May 2020, the 2 had officially become a couple, living together as husband and wife in the same Ang Mo Kio apartment. At home, Cho handled the finances, while Giau took care of cooking and household chores, managing everything with gentle diligence. Neighbors recalled how Cho often praised her, saying she was not only a wonderful cook but also thoughtful and attentive, something he admitted even his previous wives hadn't always been. However, the happiness they thought they had finally found did not last long. As the initial feelings of warmth began to fade, differences in language, culture, and lifestyle once again became a barrier too difficult to overcome. The longer they lived together, the more they realized there was an invisible distance between them, not because of a lack of affection, but because they came from 2 completely different worlds, with contrasting ways of thinking, loving, and expressing emotion. Cho Wang Kung, by nature, was an outgoing man, sociable and fond of gathering with friends over beers after work to unwind. Nguyen Ngoc Giau, on the other hand, scarred by her past marriages, longed for emotional closeness, attention, and a clear sense of commitment in their relationship. This fundamental difference slowly gave rise to conflicts, at first just small arguments over money, but gradually escalating into issues of trust and jealousy. Giau often suspected that Cho was seeing other women, especially younger women he met during his drinking sessions. Cho, in turn, grew irritated when he found that Giau secretly checked his phone, believing she was invading his privacy and showing him a lack of respect. The lack of trust and the emotional wounds they inflicted on each other slowly made the atmosphere inside the apartment suffocating. To make matters worse, both had a habit of drinking, and instead of easing tensions, alcohol only fueled their impulsiveness and anger. Arguments that might once have ended in silence now often escalated into physical altercations, as rage and intoxication mixed into a volatile combination. According to neighbor testimonies and court records presented by the defense attorney, the conflicts between Cho Wang Kung and Nguyen Ngoc Giau went far beyond drunken quarrels. They had erupted into serious physical fights on at least 3 occasions. The first incident occurred around March 2021. That evening, after drinking together, another argument broke out. Neither was willing to back down, and in a fit of anger, Cho struck Giau, injuring her face. Neighbors, alarmed by the commotion, rushed over to intervene, but the confrontation left behind a deep sense of fear and a bruise across the woman's cheek. The second incident occurred in May of the same year, when another fierce argument erupted, this time over money and trust. In anger, Giau demanded to end the relationship, asking to reclaim her personal belongings and gifts. Cho initially agreed, but later insisted that she return everything he had ever given her. Tensions escalated when Cho, accompanied by his friend Tan, a man close to both of them, tried to forcibly take back a ring and a necklace from Giau's neck. The struggle left her with scratches and emotional distress, and she eventually filed a police report, claiming she had been assaulted. The third incident, and the final warning before tragedy struck, happened in early July 2021. At that time, Giau expressed her wish to visit her 2 children, but Cho refused outright, even uttering cruel and insulting words toward her. Enraged and hurt, Giau lost control and attacked him, prompting police intervention once again. Despite several attempts to separate, Cho and Giau continued living together, as if bound by an invisible thread neither could cut. Partly it was because Giau had nowhere else to go, and partly because both were deeply lonely. Two wounded souls who, in their own painful way, still needed each other. That toxic, dead-end relationship dragged on, a repeating cycle of brief calm followed by long, stormy nights of arguments, until the fateful night of July 15th, 2021, when everything finally spun out of control. That afternoon, the spark was lit once again. Cho Wang Kung received a phone call from a young beer promoter girl, inviting him to join her and a few friends for drinks. It seemed harmless, but for a woman already fragile and insecure, it was fuel poured on the fire of jealousy. While checking his phone, Giau discovered the call and erupted in rage. A heated argument broke out between them, lasting for hours through the afternoon. Unable to bear the suffocating tension, Cho stormed out, heading off to drink with his close friend Tan and a few others. Meanwhile, throughout that long evening, the small fifth-floor apartment in Ang Mo Kio sat heavy with silence and the smell of beer. Nguyen and Ngoc sat alone at the dining table, draining one can of beer after another, as if trying to drown the anger and hurt boiling inside her. According to investigators later, she had consumed at least 10 cans of beer, possibly more. In her drunken state, Giau repeatedly called Cho over and over again, but none of the calls were answered. The cold, monotonous beep, beep on the other end only deepened the storm of jealousy and resentment inside her. Her mind slowly slipped beyond the edge of reason as alcohol, anger, and heartbreak blended into a dangerous cocktail of uncontrolled emotion. At around 3 a.m. on July 16th, Giau began behaving erratically. She walked into the kitchen and took out a kitchen knife, a wooden-handled blade about 20 centimeters long, typically used for cutting meat. In her intoxicated haze, she sharpened the knife, testing its edge by lightly cutting her own finger. The act suggested a degree of intent or preparation, though she was likely not fully conscious of her actions due to intoxication. Inside the small fifth-floor apartment at Block 562, Ang Mo Kio 5A, the suffocating atmosphere of a tragedy was quietly taking shape. In the stillness of the night, Nguyen Ngoc sat on the floor of the dark living room, the faint yellow light from the corridor seeping through the door crack, casting eerie shadows across the room. Around her lay empty beer cans scattered across the floor, silent witnesses to the hours she had spent alone, drunk, and consumed by despair. The clock struck 3:30 a.m. Her head was dizzy from alcohol, yet her heart burned with blind jealousy. Since the afternoon, she had called Cho dozens of times, each attempt answered only by the cold, repetitive tone of an unanswered call echoing through the night. Every beep felt like a knife cutting deeper into her wounded pride, fueling the anger and resentment that now surged uncontrollably inside her. As the alcohol mixed with memories of their earlier argument, the image of Cho cheerfully answering the call from the young beer promoter replayed vividly in her mind. The same woman who had invited him out for drinks. To Giau, that wasn't just an ordinary phone call, it was a blatant act of betrayal, the final drop in a long storm of jealousy and loneliness. In her drunken rage and despair, she began to think about teaching Cho a lesson. Not necessarily with the intent to kill, but rather to make him feel the pain and fury she herself was enduring. Yet from that very thought, in that dim apartment reeking of beer and alcohol, the countdown to an irreversible tragedy had already begun. At that moment, the corridor on the 5th floor remained quiet. Tan, the friend accompanying Cho, called ahead to say he was bringing him home after the night of drinking. The clock showed 12:50 a.m. as the elevator chimed softly, stopping in front of their apartment at Block 562, Ang Mo Kio 5A. When the elevator doors slid open, Cho and Tan stepped out, only to find Nguyen Ngoc already waiting by the doorway. One hand braced against the wall, her face looked weary, but her eyes burned with anger and anticipation. The moment she saw him, she rushed forward, her voice hoarse from alcohol and jealousy. Where did you go? With whom? Cho, tired and slightly drunk, knew she must have snooped through his phone earlier. Irritated, he pushed her aside, intending to head straight into the room to avoid another argument. But that simple gesture, instead of calming things, ignited an explosion. Giau screamed, lunging at him, crying and striking him in a fit of rage. Tan, startled, hurried to intervene, but it was useless. Their shouts and the sound of their struggle echoed through the empty corridor, reverberating off the cold concrete walls in the middle of the night. During the scuffle, Cho turned to Tan and shouted, "Call the police!" That single sentence was the spark that ignited the tragedy. In a sudden burst of fury, Giau broke free and dashed into the kitchen. Moments later, she emerged wielding a gleaming kitchen knife. The flash of the steel under the hallway light sent a chill down Tan's spine. In a fit of blind jealousy, Giau screamed and lunged at Cho. He tried to defend himself, but the blade sank into his shoulder, blood spraying and staining his shirt crimson. Cho stumbled backward in panic toward the elevator, yet Giau did not stop. Tan stood frozen, horrified by the brutal scene unfolding before him. The sound of screaming, struggling, and the glint of the knife's blade paralyzed him in shock. It took several seconds for him to regain his senses. Trembling, he pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos as evidence for the police. But the sudden flash of the camera caught Ju's attention. In her drunken frenzy, she whirled around, her eyes wild and unfocused, and charged toward Tan as if to attack him. Terrified, Tan kicked off his slippers, turned, and ran down the stairs in panic, shouting as he fled, his heart pounding, breath ragged, desperate to escape the nightmare. Now, in the fifth-floor corridor, only two people remained, the attacker and the victim. Cho Wang-kung lay sprawled on the cold tile floor, blood gushing from his wounds, forming a dark red pool beneath him. His breaths came out in shallow, raspy gasps, blending with the faint whistle of wind through the corridor. Nguyen Giau, meanwhile, slowly began to sober up. The blind rage that had consumed her moments earlier faded, replaced by overwhelming fear. She collapsed beside Cho, shaking him, calling his name again and again. But there was no response, only the sound of his breathing growing weaker. Until it stopped. As she stared at her blood-stained hands, realization struck. She let out a piercing cry of despair, horrified by what she had done. Images of her two young children flashed through her mind, followed by the thought of prison, punishment, and shame. Panic and hopelessness consumed her completely. In that moment, still surrounded by the smell of alcohol and blood, Giau decided to end her own life, using the same bloodied knife to bring everything to an end. The blood of two people intertwined, spreading slowly across the cold gray floor. Outside, the wail of police and ambulance sirens tore through the night air. And thus, the fateful night came to an end. After more than 3 years of detention, the case that had shocked Singapore finally reached its legal conclusion. The trial of Nguyen Giau, the Vietnamese woman accused of killing her partner Cho Wang-kung, officially opened on April 8, 2025, marking the end of a long, grim chapter, one that began with beer, jealousy, and a fatal night of July 15, 2021. That morning, the courtroom at Singapore's High Court was packed. Reporters, members of the Vietnamese community, and local residents all gathered to witness what had become one of the most closely followed cases in recent memory. A story entwined with love, violence, and tragedy behind closed doors. Nguyen Ngoc Giau entered the courtroom looking frail and emaciated. Her face was expressionless, almost detached, as she took her seat in the defendant's chair, under the gaze of dozens of journalists and camera lenses. But everything changed when the prosecutor played a short video on the courtroom screen, the footage showing Cho Wang-kung lying motionless in a pool of blood in the corridor of the Ang Mo Kio apartment block, captured on the night of the murder. Within seconds of the video appearing, Nguyen Ngoc Giau broke down in tears, her whole body trembling uncontrollably. The raw sound of her sobbing filled the otherwise silent courtroom, forcing the judge to pause the hearing for several minutes so the defendant could regain her composure. When the session resumed, the prosecution presented a firm and uncompromising argument. They asserted that this was a premeditated act of murder, claiming that Nguyen Giau acted out of hatred, jealousy, and a clear motive for revenge. To support their case, the prosecution presented a summary of the events verified by both parties and announced that they intended to call approximately 65 witnesses, most of whom had provided written testimony, all aimed at reconstructing the full chain of events leading to the crime. In addition to witness testimonies, the prosecution submitted a large body of physical evidence, including crime scene photographs, DNA analysis results, fingerprint records, and the blood-stained kitchen knife used in the attack. More notably, the prosecution also possessed 9 statements that Nguyen Giau herself had given to police during the investigation, key documents that provided insight into her mental state and shifting recollections of the night of the crime. During cross-examination, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense and charged as Giau's defense attorney began outlining his counter-strategy. Instead of focusing directly on the act of killing, he sought to contextualize the crime within the troubled relationship between the defendant and the victim. He began by questioning witness Tan, the close friend who had been present that night, asking whether Cho had previously been married and if he had experienced marital difficulties, a move aimed at establishing that the victim himself carried emotional scars and inner conflicts. Skillfully, the defense painted a contrasting portrait of the victim, not as an entirely innocent man, but as someone who also shared responsibility for the toxic dynamic that led to tragedy. According to this line of defense, the incident was not an act of calculated murder, but rather the result of escalating emotional conflict, mutual provocation, and psychological breakdown. A chain reaction that spiraled fatally out of control. In the days that followed, the court continued to review the technical evidence presented by both sides, including forensic reports, crime scene analyses, and, most importantly, the psychiatric evaluation of Nguyen Giau. The prosecution also presented a series of videos and photos extracted from mobile phones and surveillance cameras, capturing the scene in the aftermath of the crime. When those images appeared on the courtroom screen, Nguyen Giau once again broke down in tears, sobbing uncontrollably. A moment so raw and emotional that many in attendance sat in heavy silence. By April 17, 2025, the defendant took the witness stand for the first time, speaking through a Vietnamese interpreter to recount her life story. In a trembling, broken voice, she admitted that her relationship with Cho had been turbulent, marked by both affection and deep resentment. Guided by her defense lawyer, she recounted the 3 major fights that had occurred before the fatal night, and described how, despite wanting to leave many times, she was held back by fear, emotional dependence, and even threats from Cho himself. As the proceedings moved into her direct testimony about the fatal night, the courtroom fell utterly silent. All eyes were fixed on Nguyen Giau, standing at the witness stand, her voice trembling. She began to recount the chain of events, insisting that the tragedy had not erupted suddenly, but had been simmering for 2 to 3 days prior, sparked by jealousy over a young woman she believed to be Cho's new lover. According to her account, the tension had been building, through text messages, repeated quarrels, and a growing sense of betrayal that eventually overwhelmed her ability to control her emotions. Fighting through tears, she told the court she never intended to take Cho's life, claiming that the act occurred in a drunken haze when her judgment was completely clouded. "I only wanted to scare him a little. I didn't mean to kill him," she sobbed, her voice breaking. Her words bolstered the defense's argument that her actions were spontaneous, carried out while intoxicated, emotionally unstable, and unable to control herself, and therefore could not be classified as premeditated murder. However, the prosecution swiftly countered with what they called a decisive piece of evidence: her act of sharpening the knife before the attack. The prosecutor emphasized that this act showed deliberate preparation and intent, proving that the defendant had harbored thoughts of revenge prior to the killing rather than acting unconsciously under the influence of alcohol. A man lost his life, a woman lost her freedom, and 2 children lost their mother, forever. That is the terrible price of a few moments of lost control, and that concludes today's case. What do you think about this tragic story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.